Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Pesachim. We are up to Perik Chet Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai ben Eliyahu ben Burcha Yisraelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. A person who is tameh, impure on Erev Pesach, and will continue to be impure that night, cannot be part of a Pesach offering, since he will not be able to eat from it that night. Our Mishnah teaches, however, that a person who is impure on Erev Pesach can join in a Pesach offering if his impurity will be gone by nightfall. Now the Rav explains the only exception is someone who contracted impurity from a corpse, even if the seventh day of his purification falls on Erev Pesach, and he will definitely become pure by nightfall. He may not join a group slaughtering the Pesach offering, and this is learned from a verse in the Torah. The Mishnah begins, Zav shera'a shtei riyot, a Zav who experienced two emissions, literally saw two sightings. Now just to explain, a Zav is a man who becomes impure through a series of involuntary bodily emissions. The Torah speaks about in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 15, Psukim 1 through 15. If he experiences these emissions twice on the same day or on two consecutive days, he is tameh for 7 days, after which he immerses himself in a natural spring and becomes tahor at night. If he experiences 3 such emissions on the same day or on 3 consecutive days, he must also bring a set of offerings on the day after his immersion to complete this purification. Until these offerings are brought, he may not eat from any sacrificial offerings. The Mishnah says, Zav shera'a shtei riyot, a Zav who experienced 2 emissions, immerses himself on the 7th day of his tumah and becomes pure at nightfall. Now a tameh person who immerses himself to become pure does not become fully tahor until nightfall after his immersion. Until then, he remains impure with respect to terumah, and sacrificial offerings will be called kodashim. The Mishnah says, in this case, where he immersed himself on the 7th day and becomes tahor at nightfall, shochatin alav b'shvi'i, we may slaughter the Pesach offering on his behalf on the 7th day of his impurity if it falls on Erev Pesach, since he will be able to eat from the offering that night. The Rav does say, however, he must immerse himself before slaughtering the Pesach so that it is certain that his tumah will be gone at nightfall. Ra'a shalosh, if he experienced 3 emissions on the same day or on 3 consecutive days, so that in addition to immersing himself on the 7th day, he must also bring Zav offerings on the 8th day before he may eat the sacrificial offerings. Shochatin alav b'shmini shelo, we may slaughter the Pesach on his behalf on Erev Pesach if it is his 8th day of Tumah. However, the Rav does say he must at least deposit the money for his Zav offerings in the temple chest, marked for that purpose, so that we may be sure that his offerings will be brought that day and his Tumah will be fully gone at nightfall. Now the Kohanim made sure to empty the chest each day and sacrifice all their offerings for which money had been deposited. That's why we must make sure that he deposits the money for his offerings, that he will be able to eat the sacrifice that night. The Mishnah now discusses the rule for a woman who experienced abnormal blood flows. Now, when a woman's menstrual flow begins, it is normal for it to continue anywhere from 1 to 7 days. A flow that occurs during the following 11 days, from day 8 to day 18 from the beginning of her period, is considered abnormal. If, after purifying herself from her original flow, she experiences a single flow within those 11 days, from day 8 to day 18, she is impure until the following day. She then immerses herself and remains tameh until nightfall. If she experiences another flow on that 2nd day, she remains tameh until the 3rd day, when she immerses herself and remains tameh until nightfall. If she experiences yet another flow on the 3rd day, she becomes a zava and remains tameh until 7 consecutive days pass with no flow at all. She may then immerse herself on the 7th clean day, but she remains tameh until she brings her zava offerings on the 8th day. Now this is the biblical law. By rabbinic law enacted after the time of the Mishnah, a woman must always wait for 7 clean days before immersing herself in a mikveh to become tahor. The Mishnah says, Shomeret yom keneged yom, a woman who observes a day corresponding to a day, meaning she experienced abnormal blood flow for 1 day, becomes tahor by immersing herself the next day and waiting until nightfall. Shochatin aleh b'sheni shelah. Therefore, we may slaughter a Pesach offering on her behalf on her 2nd day, meaning on the day following her flow, provided she immersed herself before slaughtering, so that she will certainly be tahor at nightfall. Ra'ata shnei yamim, if she experienced abnormal flows on 2 consecutive days, in which case she purifies herself by immersing on the 3rd day and waiting until nightfall. Shochatin nala b'shlishi, we may slaughter a Pesach offering on her behalf on the 3rd day. Again, provided she immersed herself before the slaughtering, so that she will certainly be tahor after nightfall. Vazava, for a zava who must observe 7 clean days and then bring offerings on the 8th day, and who is forbidden to eat sacrificial offerings until then. Shochatin elea b'shmini, we may slaughter a Pesach offering on her behalf only on Erev Pesach that falls on the 8th day of her Tumah. And here too, again, she must deposit the money for offerings before we may slaughter a Pesach on her behalf to make sure that she will be able to eat it that night. And that is then the Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Vav now discusses the rule for certain people whose situation on Erev Pesach calls into question whether they will be able to eat the Pesach offering that night. Ha'onen, the law for an onen, someone who, God forbid, lost a close relative, whose close relative died that day, who is rabbinically forbidden to eat sacrificial offerings the night after his relative's death, which the commentators explain, upon the death of any of one's 7 closest relatives, father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, and spouse. A person enters a state called aninut, which lasts until burial, and he is known as a onen. An onen is biblically forbidden to eat from sacrificial offerings until nightfall of the day on which the death occurred. Rabbinic law extends this prohibition to the night after the death as well, even if the relative was buried during that day. And the Mishnah here speaks of an onen who did not become tameh from the corpse of his relative. Had he become tameh, he would remain tameh for at least 7 days and would not be eligible to eat the Pesach that night. So we're not talking about somebody who became impure from the body, just someone who's an onen. So the Mishnah says the law for an onen, v'amfakech et agal, as well as someone removing a pile of rubble from on top of a trapped person, who, if the person is dead, becomes tameh from the corpse. Now the Rav explains a building collapsed on top of a person and trapped him. Rescuers are trying to reach him by pulling off the rubble. If the victim is dead, these rescuers have become impure tameh. Even if the rescuers did not touch the corpse, they will have leaned over it, which would make them tameh. And so to someone whose jailers promised to release him from prison by nightfall of Pesach. And an ill person or an old person who is capable of eating a kazait, an olive's volume of meat, despite his weakness, which we know one must eat at least an olive's volume of kazait of the Pesach offering in order to fulfill the mitzvah. The Mishnah says, shochatin alehen. The law in all these cases is that we may slaughter the Pesach offering on their behalf. And the commentaries explain, since the prohibition for an onen to eat the meat of offerings at night is only rabbinic, the rabbis waived their prohibition for the sake of allowing him to eat the Pesach offering. Now this is because offering the Pesach is an unusually strict mitzvah, since failure to bring it carries a penalty of karet. And since, moving on to the next case, since the person removing the rubble does not know whether the victim was dead, we assume him to be tahor and allow him to eat the Pesach. Now this is based on the principle of Chazakah, the Rav says, which tells us to assume in cases of doubt that a person's legal status has not changed. In the case of the prisoner, we assume that the jailers will keep their word and release him in time to eat the Pesach. In the case of the sick and elderly, we assume that they will remain well enough to eat an olive's volume of meat that night. Now again, the Rav does explain by the case of the person that removed the pile of rubble from the top of the trapped person, we slaughter it assuming they will remain pure. If it ends up coming out that the person was deceased under the rubble, obviously they will not be able to eat the korban because they will have become impure. But when we slaughter it before, we assume that they will remain tahor. The Mishnah now adds a condition, al kulan in shochatin alen bifnei atzman. For all of these, however, we do not slaughter on their behalf as a group by themselves. Shema yaviu et Pesach lidei pisul, because we are concerned that they may cause the meat of the Pesach offering to be disqualified by leaving it uneaten, should it turn out that all of them are unable to eat it that night. Meaning, the onen in his grief might forget that he needs to eat the Pesach offering that night and touch or lean over his deceased relative, thereby becoming tameh. Even if the relative was buried before the Pesach offering was slaughtered, we are concerned that the onen might be unable to eat anything that night due to his grief. The rescuer removing the rubble might find out that he is tameh if it turns out that the person underneath it was dead. The prisoner might not be released, and the older sick person might become weaker by nighttime and be unable to eat the required amount of meat. So the Mishnah says, for themselves, we will not slaughter it. Therefore, they must join a group that includes others, so that in the worst case, those others will eat the meat. The Mishnah now teaches what happens to these people if they join a group and it turns out they are unable to eat from the Pesach. Lefikach. Therefore, since at the time the offering was slaughtered and his blood was placed on the altar, these people were expected to be able to eat it. If a disqualification of the kind we fear happened to them afterward, and it turns out that they could not eat the Pesach, Piturin milasot Pesach Sheni, they are exempt from making a second Pesach offering. Once a person's Pesach has been offered, he has fulfilled his mitzvah of bringing a Pesach, even if he ends up not eating any of it. Since these people were allowed to make a Pesach offering, they fulfilled their obligation. Chutz minam fakech bagal, except for the one removing the rubble, who if the person buried under it turns out to be dead, may not eat that night. Shu tameh mitchilato, since we then see that he was tameh from the start, meaning from before his Pesach was slaughtered. Therefore, he was never eligible to have a Pesach offered for him, and he has to make it up on Pesach Sheni. And the commentators explain, although at the time the Pesach was slaughtered, we did not know whether the victim was dead or alive. If we discover later in the day or evening that he was indeed dead, then it turns out that the rescuer became tameh as soon as he began pulling rubble off the pile. It's therefore clear that he was tameh at the time his Pesach was slaughtered. Now this applies only if the rubble pile was narrow, so that as soon as he began removing it, he must have leaned over the corpse and become tameh. But if the pile was spread out, so it's possible that he had not leaned over the body by the time the Pesach was slaughtered, he does not need to bring a second Pesach offering. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.